Evening, folks. Good evening, folks. How you doing? My name is Wasim Kanan with the New Jersey chapter of American Muslims for Palestine. Man, we have an evening of great information, heavy hitters. We're here today to talk about Black voter suppression in America, past and in the 2020 elections, and to talk about gerrymandering and other aspects of the effort to suppress the Black vote in the United States. As you see, we have great speakers lined up for today, some very notable individuals who've really poured their heart and soul into the movement and fighting for justice of all types. So thank you all for joining us today for this great event. And I'm looking forward, and I promise you, I'm just as excited as the rest of you are. So we're going to work our way through some important topics. We're going to start talking about the history of Black voter suppression in America and what it has caused in the past. Then we're going to begin to talk a little bit about gerrymandering and the role of the state legislature when it comes to establishing policies like that, and then also their role in addressing that. And then we're going to be talking about the role that the popular movements that we see today rising. Obviously, they didn't start today, but they're at the movement for Black lives and the movement, the people's struggle in the United States is just as alive and well as it has ever been. And then finally, we're going to contextualize what effect Black voter suppression has on the 2020 elections, and hear a little bit about what's been going on in American politics today to honestly weaken America and USPS's ability to process mail-in ballots for this election. So with that, I want to start by welcoming our first panelist, Mr. Bill Fletcher. Mr. Bill Fletcher has been an activist since his teen years. Upon graduating from college, he worked as a welder in a shipyard, and he entered the labor movement. Over the years, he's been active in the workplace, in the community struggles, as well as electoral campaigns. He's worked for several labor unions, in addition to serving as a senior staff person for the National AFL-CIO. He is the former president of Trans Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, an editorial board member of the blackcommentator.com, and is in leadership of several other projects. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Fletcher to share with us some comments, and specifically, if you may, discuss. If you may discuss with us how voter suppression has been used as a tool historically in America.
Well, thank you, and assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum assalam.
It's an honor and pleasure to be with you tonight. Well, let me make this brief. I think it's really important to understand that since the founding of the United States, there has been a fight to expand the franchise. That is, the fight to expand who can vote. And initially, it was not only just restricted on the basis of race, but also restricted on the basis of gender and on property. So that the people, we talk about the United States being a democracy. Well, it sort of is like the song goes, compared to what? Because it was basically a question of who was able to make the decisions and who was not. Now, when the Civil War was won and Africans were liberated, there were initial attempts by the southern former Confederate states to re-disenfranchise the Africans. And that failed for about 15 years during a period of what's called Reconstruction. After the Reconstruction period, when there was a height of both Black political power as well as the political power for poor people in the South, there was a counterattack, what W.E.B. Du Bois described as the counter-revolution of property, in which the rich, the elite in the South, united with the poor whites in the South in order to crush the African American and to crush the poor. So lesson number one was that different disenfranchisement although the target was African Americans in the 1870s, aimed at something far broader. The elite in the South wanted to disenfranchise poor people. They wanted to ensure that they could remain in dominance. And in order to do that, they made the African the target and blaming the African, basically pointing at the African as a threat to the white. And that was very successful in terms of convincing white people that African Americans were somehow a threat. The disenfranchisement, though, took a number of years, about 30 years, to actually become completely successful. And there were various steps that were introduced, including some things that we're beginning to see again. A poll tax, that is an amount that you had to pay in order to be able to vote. A literacy test in order to prove that you were a qualified voter. Many times African Americans and poor whites were asked to read and interpret state constitutions. You had vagrancy laws, which were used in order to round up freed African Americans, often jail them and make them ineligible to vote. And of course, there were restrictions on the rights of formerly incarcerated prisoners and their ability to vote, which was something that was frequently taken away from them. And in the case of Virginia, what's interesting, and it came out within the last few years in a whole discussion about re-enfranchising the formerly incarcerated, was that the legislative history points to the objective of disenfranchising formerly incarcerated was aimed at enhancing white supremacy. This is in the first decade of the 20th century, enhancing white supremacy and eliminating the supposed threat from the Black voter. So there were a whole series of things, and I would add on to this naked terror, which I think is important to talk about, particularly in light of today and this attempted coup in Michigan carried out by these white militia folks against the governor, which the legacy of which is, of course, the Wilmington coup of 1898, in which a legitimately elected multiracial coalition of Black and white populists was overthrown by white supremacists in an armed uprising, and the federal government and the state government of North Carolina did nothing about it. So we see that occurring once again. So the use of naked terror, Ku Klux Klan, groups like that, and all of that conspired to deprive the African American of the vote. But here's the thing that white people got to understand. It's a lesson that many of our parents would say to us. If you're going to keep someone in the sewer, you got to stand there to make sure that they don't escape. And poor whites have been standing there right on top of the sewer as the water has been around their ankles in order to make sure that we don't escape.
Mr. Fletcher, thank you so much for sharing that. While speaking, obviously there are so many parallels between what you've just discussed in contemporary times. And I look forward to being able to touch upon that. But I guess fast forward a little bit closer to today, I'd like to turn to State Senator Brian Williams of Missouri. So real quick, the state senator is a proud representative of Missouri's 14th state district. He grew up in a labor union family that instilled the importance of hard work and investing in the community. Throughout his career, Senator Williams worked tirelessly to strengthen the community, and he helped develop a quality healthcare center in Ferguson, Missouri, and oversaw the rollout of the Affordable Care Act marketplace in Missouri as a congressional ACA coordinator. Senator Williams, I'd like to turn to you, and I'd like to ask you briefly, define for our audience what gerrymandering is, and then describe what effects it has on the electorate and the role of the state legislators in challenging that practice that has disenfranchised so many.
Absolutely. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be on with Mr. Fletcher and Reverend Smart. And to talk about some really challenging issues that have impacted our country and has really defined not only what representation looks like, but how we go about policies that ultimately support and enable folks of various demographics to be able to thrive. The most important thing an American can do is exercise their constitutional right to vote. So voting is how your voice is heard. And if there's one thing that's clear, that people across the political spectrum wants to be heard. And we share our views on Facebook and Twitter. We share our views, apparently, pictures of food on Instagram. And we read the news and we react to the news. And we talk about issues with our friends and our coworkers, and we avoid those issues with the one aunt that still forwards emails. To get to your question and your point, this is not gerrymandering. Is more of a conversation about how do we fight voter suppression, and voting is a collective action in the democratic process. When the Black community is energized and active, we get results. Here in the communities that I represent, that means folks like Kim Gardner, and we have our first Black St. Louis County prosecutor here, where I live in St. Louis, Wesley Bell, and a strong team of Black leaders in the legislature. In 2008 and in 2012, it met Barack Obama. And of course, the opposite is also true. In 2016, for the first time in 2 decades, Black voters turnout actually decreased. In fact, Black voter turnout dropped 7% between 2012 and 2016, the largest drop for Black turnout on record. There are many theories as to what caused this drop. I believe part of the problem is voter suppression and gerrymandering. When polling places and Black communities are shut down, folks can't get out to vote. When states require a new poll tax through voter ID, when the Trump administration sabotages the Postal Service, which is already strained in the urban core, when you get fewer ballot casts, fewer Black ballots cast, voter suppression is a tool used to discourage that collective action. And that also happens in the form of folks participating in the census. So you have a decline in population. We almost make the argument for legislatures where I serve that are predominantly Republican to make a case on eliminating a congressional district or potentially placing a systemic attack on what that representation looks like. So we need to be able to recognize it when we see it and figure out how to overcome it. And that's why we're having this conversation today. And this year, we need everyone who can to vote. And remember that the election ends on November 3rd, but it begins right now.
That is a great point. We are living in a time where this election cycle is entirely different. I don't think people realize that you don't vote on the 3rd. You vote now, and you have to get your mail postmarked before November 3rd when you send your ballot in. Thank you, Senator, for sharing that. Some great points, and I'm excited to come back to that. So I'd like to take a second and welcome Congressman Carson to the conversation. And my pleasure, sir. And I'd like to turn to Reverend Smart. So Reverend Smart, Reverend William D. Smart Jr. is the president and the CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Southern California. He is also co-pastor of the Christ Liberation Ministries in Los Angeles, where his wife serves as senior pastor. He recently served as director of external training and outreach to the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, a nationally recognized nonprofit organization where he's worked for almost 10 years. Reverend Smart, you've had so much time working on the streets. You are a street warrior. I thank you for all that you've done for the movement. And so for that reason, I want to ask you specifically, what is the role of popular movements in fighting back against Black voter suppression today? And what role can the movement play in eradicating existing policies that assist in Black voter suppression, for example, gerrymandering or the disenfranchisement we see as a result of mass incarceration in America?
Thank you, Thank you very much, Brother Wasim, and to this distinguished panelist of men that I have read about, heard about most of my life, and it's just good to be, and I'm honored to be in your presence today. When you have, as the president of Martin Luther King's organization here in Southern California, one of the things that Dr. King really believed in was a four-pronged approach. Number one, we had to fight to get the right to vote. You had to fight to do that. Once you got it, you had to fight to register people to vote. Then you have to get them to the polls. And then after they elect someone or change public policy was the final thing. And what part of the answer to your question is just that. We have to change public policy. And a lot of times the popular movement, those type of organizations have, in one aspect or another, they have done one of those things. Right now, Black Lives Matter, not the movement for Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter, the organization around the country, they're in the streets and they're raising public policy. They're raising the issues right here in California. Right here in Southern California, 2.5 years, Black Lives Matter has been fighting the local deputy district attorney. And the district attorney for 2.5 years. They have every Wednesday they're in front of her office. That's helping to change public policy. It has galvanized the movement, and she's on the ballot now. And who knows what's going to happen on November the 3rd? But that's one of the things they do. That you have popular movements have to transform the public policy. Another thing that popular movements are doing is they're galvanizing people through social media. Social media, these popular movements, not just Black Lives Matter, but another popular movement that we work closely with is Women's March. And they're all over the country now having people to vote, making calls, that aggressiveness that it takes to bring the masses so they, and the social media to these causes and to these elections and changing elected officials, making, that they're doing that. These movements are doing that. It's so important when you talk about voting. One of the things that the old traditional popular movements that I'm a part of, SCLC, we have with 60 other organizations, we have instituted in Southern California that the month of October is election month. We have set up an election month coalition, and we're going around doing all types of activities, letting people know that you are voting right now. As someone mentioned, you're voting right now, and it's very important for us to understand that we have until November 3rd, but we want everyone finished voting by November 1st. We want everyone to have voted, and there's so many ways in California that can be done. And a lot of the popular movements, a lot of the organizations are really working with us, and they're doing their own thing. And it is becoming so essential that we vote. And that's one of the ways that we overcome the gerrymandering, because we just have come out of the census awareness, and we've been doing that for 6 months. A lot of the other organizations have been doing it for 6 months, and that's important because that's where we determine who has the seats, who can get the seats, where the population is, and all of that. So that works hand in hand with really attenuating the effects of gerrymandering in our country and the effects on African Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And then also, as Mr. Fletcher referenced, so many others in America, right? Because the goal is to, among the people, to blame one specific group and take the attention off of those who are intentionally causing these oppressive laws. Thank you so much for that, Reverend. And then we're going to turn to the Honorable André Carson of Indiana's 7th District. Congressman Carson, now in his 6th full term in the U.S. House of Representatives, continues to fight for the working class, securing investments and opportunities for constituents in education, infrastructure, and the creation of jobs. In this current 116th Congress, Congressman Carson serves on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, sitting on the Aviation and the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials subcommittees. He also serves as a senior whip for the House Democratic Caucus as one of 3 Muslims serving in Congress. Congressman Carson is a champion for vulnerable populations and is committed to the goal of equal protection under the law. So thank you so much for joining us, Congressman Carson. And briefly, talk to us about the context of Black voter suppression in terms of the 2020 election, in relation to mail-in voting, and the recent efforts to weaken the integrity of the USPS and actions taken by the House to counter that.
Well, thank you very much. I too am honored to be here with such an august body of brothers who are making a difference in their communities in our country. I think, really in this modern era, this is probably the most widespread and insidious way that Black people's power and voices are diminished. A lot of attention is placed on voter suppression and tactics in places like Georgia, North Carolina, and other southern states. But it's not just confined to the South with our southern brothers and sisters. Across the country, states are being enabled to keep Black folks from voting through voter suppression laws and diluting our representation, as the pastor said, through gerrymandering. You have states and federal legislatures really looking at, particularly with the states, redrawing districts every 10 years after the census to follow the population shifts and apportion elective districts so people are represented fairly. That's what they should do. But, these political lines are never straight. Unlike state boundaries, those legislative districts, they may follow roads or rivers surrounding local institutions like factories or universities, communities, or connect communities of interest like farming and agricultural communities or urban communities like mine in Indianapolis. But unfortunately, we're seeing extreme gerrymandering has really gotten out of control, quite frankly. You have these computer-assisted map drawing and digital voter preference data. And so you have legislative districts that have grown less and less about communities and more about political affiliation. So the results are you're packing people together for partisan advantages and really failing to provide diverse communities with representation. It's intentional. It has happened since the so-called freeing of the slaves. And, I believe that legislative districts should be drawn to give all communities the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, not stacking the partisan deck. So, voter suppression tactics have only gotten worse, I believe, in the past 6 or 7 years. In 2013, many of us remembered, Shelby versus Holder, the Supreme Court decision that effectively weakened voting rights, making it easier for our leaders to ignore the safeguards put in place to really give our communities a voice. Even in her dissent, the late Justice Ginsburg said, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. So the Voting Rights Act is precisely why voting rights have improved for Black people, but now we're seeing the manipulation. So we have to get past the days when politicians can go to our churches, our mosques, our community centers, do the electric slide, do the running man, get our vote. But when they get into office, they vote against our interests.
And so I guess thank you for that, Congressman. The idea here is to put all these facets together, right? We're talking about potentially when individuals get into office, they go against the interests of the people. You know what I mean? That's why it's so important to have people like Reverend Smart, Mr. Fletcher here to talk about the movements and talk about what roles we can play in countering those actions. So I want to hear a little more from Mr. Fletcher. Mr. Fletcher, talk more about the fear on the ground, about the dangers in this upcoming election season and the potential actions that may come from the current administration to weaken mail-in voting infrastructure.
Well, my greatest fear is that there's going to be a coup, to be blunt. Trump, and as was represented by Pence last night, are offering no assurances that if their ticket loses, that they'll step out of office. So I think that one of the things that we have to really be thinking about is to ensure that there's a massive voter turnout where the Trump-Pence ticket is decisively defeated. And then we have to be prepared to take whatever actions necessary, nonviolently, to ensure that the proper retirement for the Trump-Pence administration is arranged. We have to make sure that if they lose, that they are escorted out of office. We cannot have a situation like we had in 2000, where in that case, the Gore campaign sat back while the Bush team orchestrated a completely fraudulent image of what was going on in Florida, when masses of African Americans and Jews in particular were protesting, demanding that their vote be counted, and the Gore campaign sat back, attempting to look like they were the adult in the room, while Bush and team stole the election. We cannot sit back and think that this stuff will be resolved without us showing that we, the people of the United States, are not going to take it. We're simply not going to sit back when our rights are ripped away from us, because we're looking at a situation, just as I was talking about earlier, with these fascists. And I'm using that term very explicitly. These fascists, these armed fascists, were planning a coup in Michigan. It's like, what the heck do people need to think about? I mean, what are we joking? And these are people that Trump describes as there's good people on both sides. We have to be prepared to act. We have to make sure that we outnumber these fascists 10-1. We need to make sure that if DHS shows up at the voting polls, we outnumber them 10-1. We have to make sure that people can vote, that the vote is counted, and that nobody steals this from us.
Yeah, absolutely. Congressman, can you speak to what the House is doing to ensure the integrity of mail-in voting in the USPS, or has done rather?
Well, the House, quite frankly, is divided right now. I think one of the things that we tried to do when we passed the CARES Act was to protect that kind of mechanism. But obviously, Mitch McConnell has other objectives. He has a third of his membership who are up on the ballot this year. And unfortunately, what they fear is a tyrannical president, a narcissistic president, from coming into their states or even their districts saying, you know what, I love your state, I love this city, but your congressman or congresswoman is terrible. And that alone could jeopardize someone's reelection efforts. So that's a very tough space to be in. But, a lot of Republicans, I think, who probably would love to stand in solidarity with Democrats as it relates to mail-in voting are too afraid of Donald Trump, including Mitch McConnell. And so it makes it difficult to kind of be in line with the spirit of the founding fathers, who were slaveholders and who were very complicated. But we're very visionary in setting up three separate but equal branches of government. Mitch McConnell was still sitting on the bill. You know, one of the things that we've talked about, and I'm hearing more and more from my constituents and folks across the country, as we're encouraging them to participate in mail-in voting, I'm hearing more and more people talk about online voting. And I think we're years away from getting to that point, because one, there are so many vulnerabilities in our systems that it's difficult to do. Right now, you do have small forms of online voting with some of our military personnel and states in the Northeast. The smaller states, they've experimented with online voting for more localized elections. But the difficulty is that in protecting this process, you still have Russia, you still have China, you have both state and non-state actors who are continually hacking into our systems, dispatching bots to influence the hearts and minds of the American people. And while we're talking about online voting and mail-in voting and having an encrypted system, you don't want a system that's so encrypted that it becomes impenetrable and you can't catch human traffickers. And so we're wrestling with this as we speak, but it's been something that Speaker Pelosi and those of us in the caucus and folks like me who sit on the intel community have been trying to urge Republicans to be bold about, but they failed to do so at this point.
And so, there's so much beyond just mail-in voting, right? We know that there is in-person voting this time around. And the issue is that the proponents of these laws, of the laws that honestly bring about voter suppression laws, voter suppression, for example, voter ID laws, the proponents of those laws argue that these are just measures to avoid voter fraud, right? This question is to the entire panel. What would be your response to that?
I'll start first. One, there has been very minimal cases of voter fraud in this country. And I think the question isn't about voter fraud. It's about how do we address voter suppression? And that's really has been the trajectory around this conversation. Right here in the state of Missouri, where I serve in the Senate, fighting voter suppression is something that we have to understand requires a collective action in terms of the democratic process. We have something going on here now that'll be on the ballot in November called Amendment 3. I represent communities like Ferguson and beyond in the city of St. Louis, but this is not something that just impacts the urban core. Amendment 3, what it would do is it would basically undo a constitutional amendment that was passed here in the state of Missouri by the voters. This is something, a constitutional amendment that was passed with 62% of the vote in 2018. It was endorsed by the NAACP, Organizations for Black Struggle, and many others. And because Clean Missouri ensured that communities of color would not have their votes watered down or traded away, the Republican Party decided to offer a counter, which was in clear opposition of the voters' will, to lead to Black people being undercounted and underrepresented in the legislature. Right now, legislative districts are drawn based on total population. If Amendment 3, which would be on the ballot in Missouri here, passes, it would change it so that districts are drawn basically only on the number of eligible voters. Simply, it would stop counting kids. That would make a big difference in rural Missouri where residents are older where there's not a lot of kids. It would also make a huge difference in communities like mine, where in fact, there's at least 28% of Black Missourians that are under the age of 18. If they're not counted, then that's 28% less power that we have in the legislature. And to throw another statistic out there, at least 36% of Latino Missourians are under the age of 18. So if you don't count kids, you'll be leaving out more Black and more Hispanic children than any other group. That also includes the Palestinian community, which I have a large Palestinian community, which is in the Ferguson area and beyond. So that's voter suppression. And that's one of the many reasons why we must defeat amendments like this that's happening all over the country, including various parts of the panelists where Congressman Carson represents in Indianapolis and Indiana. We have to be very conscious of these things. And they use voter fraud as a way of addressing it. One last thing, and I don't want to be too long-winded. In the legislature, I fought a bill today in Missouri to vote with a mail-in ballot. You have to have that ballot notarized. As we all know, that creates a barrier in various communities to have to go and get a notary in the middle of a pandemic. Right now, if you don't feel comfortable being face-to-face or immunocompromised or whatever a health condition may be that limits you to face-to-face or personal contact with people, if you're under the age of 65 and can't vote absentee, you cannot vote without having that ballot notarized. And as we know, to get a ballot notarized, both parties have to be present. That is a form of voter suppression in the narrative of voter fraud. So I think we need to be very conscious of that. I don't know, and I'm interested to hear from other panelists, but I don't know of any case of voter fraud in this country. But I do know of many cases of voter suppression, and that's one example.
Yes, but yeah, and thank you, my brother. And what I was going to simply say too is that the current occupant of the White House has told his people to go watch polls. Now, what that means, that is a bell whistle to them. In the states that they can, they're going to be around polls, maybe the distance they're supposed to, carrying guns, different things like that. That's the form of intimidation. That's voter suppression. The second thing, some of these secretaries of state have purged the rolls, particularly where heavily Black and brown brothers and sisters are living, and that is a form of voter suppression. All of this so that they can get back the white, so he can maintain his position. How do we fight that? First of all, we have to show up at the polls too. Number one, not only to vote, there are some organizations around the country that are galvanizing people to poll watch and just to be around. That's important. Number two, while it's 20 some odd days out, we still have time to check our rolls. There's a lot of organizations and there's a lot of ways you can check your roll to make sure you're still on the registers. Luckily, I live in a blue state. So what we're doing, if you want to know what we're doing, we're massive groups of organizations in California are working with states all over, campaigns all over, calling, and my young people are mailing notes to people to vote. There's a lot going on because we need to let people know that they've got to vote. We got to vote these fools out of office. Our livelihoods depend on it.
Absolutely. That was powerful. Thank you both so much for that. Really, really quick, I'm going to state that AMP is a nonpartisan organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit.
Sorry, I said that. I got carried away.
That wasn't just you, Rev. This is just a
No. I think Rev is right. AMP is a 501c3, but that doesn't mean that participants can't make political endorsements. The organization as a body can't, but participants can. So the hell with Trump, get him out of office. I'm with you, Rev. All due respect.
And on that note, that is not
protect the nonprofit status, brother. But look here, you got 4 brothers on the panel.
Yes, sir.
It's wartime.
Yes, sir.
That's right.
We're gonna protect your status.
That's right,
brother. We love you. We respect you. But we came to bring the thunder. Do your thing, though, brother. I'm sorry. I'm a passionate brother. I'm sorry.
Hey, look, your passion is
you gotta remember, we don't want to get too far off cue, but you gotta understand, this is a fight for the lifeline of this country. I serve as the only Black man in the Missouri Senate, the entire state of Missouri. That's 6 million people here, and I can tell you right now, the perspective and the mindset of folks that do not understand the challenges and what this country has been revealed for due and its shortcomings due through a pandemic, we have to turn up and we have to be out there on November 3rd. Being, you have two options in life, and I've learned this serving as a state senator, is that you can either fight for what's right, or you could sit down and try to be nice with folks, and being nice is not getting us anywhere. We have to really be aggressive. And if anyone had watched that vice president debate last night, I posted something on social media, and the first thing I thought about was my mother, who's a Black woman. We're 19 years apart. And I said, Kamala had to do everything she could to not come across as angry, emotional, and combative, but also be firm, warm, honest, and direct. While this guy is straight up lying and gaslighting the entire time.
Yeah.
So we can't afford to be nice right now and be political and all that. We got to really get out on November 3rd. And we're going to have 4 years of serious consequences.
That's real talk. But we want to protect your 501c3, brother. So we know you did not make an endorsement representative, but we can talk that talk. All right.
Absolutely.
You're welcome to speak your truth, sir. You're welcome to speak your truth. And I want to build off that, right? It's the stark similarities in Mr. Fletcher's opening comments. He talked about the use of naked terror in the late 19th century, early 20th century. How does that relate to today?
We just saw it with the thwarting of an attempted kidnapping of a governor. When, coming out of the law enforcement space, not only have I been arrested and targeted racially and religiously, I was also in law enforcement, and I worked for the Indiana Department of Homeland Security and Counterterrorism. And I have said for years, the largest threat to our internal security comes from white supremacists, not Muslims, not Latinos, not Black folks, white supremacists. When I was in the police academy in 1999, there was a young recruit. He had a T-shirt. It had Mussolini, Stalin, Hitler, and two other leaders. The other recruits, including myself, we confronted him and we reported him to the training captain. And the young man very naively or innocently said, "I don't agree with everything Hitler said, but he did do some good things." A lot of stuff that you're seeing by these police officers, it's a thankless job. It starts and is solidified in these police academies and police training. So some of these white supremacists are part-time police officers. They're prior military. And when Donald Trump talks about taking America back to the good old days, this mythical good old days that never existed, not only is he dog whistling, he's saying, if you want to preserve our republic, you know what to do, Proud Boys. Stand back and stand down, wink, 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 go get them. So I'm happy that those in law enforcement, many Black folks and Muslims, by the way, working hard in our communities. We'll talk about law enforcement another time, but are thwarting these attacks that you'll never hear about. So the naked terror that we're talking about, it comes from the death threats that I get. It comes from the death threats that some of our panelists get on the call. It comes from folks who say that they want to see change. And unfortunately, some of our liberal brothers and sisters, they practice a form of soft bigotry that still upholds the tenets and pillars of white supremacy.
If I can just build on what the Congressman is saying.
Yeah.
See, I think it's really important for us to understand that this is not new. That's why I began with the discussion about the 19th century. We see these patterns in U.S. history that recur. And one of the problems is if you look at history as linear, and this is the problem actually with Martin Luther King's very famous statement about the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
I actually think King was wrong. The arc of history is long. Question is, where it bends, history demonstrates time and again that sometimes it bends it completely in reverse and that things turn in a really bad way. And therefore, we cannot sit back and expect that things are going to somehow improve on their own. They will improve to the extent to which we fight and fight hard. Now, the other part of this is in building on what the congressman was saying, this issue about white supremacists. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. During the Obama administration, there was a DHS report that came out that documented exactly what the congressman said, that the white supremacists, these white right-wing groups, were the greatest threat. So what happened? Republicans in Congress started protesting. They started yapping about how this was an attack on the conservatives. And the Obama administration, as it repeatedly did, backed down. They backed down and they basically dismissed the document. Instead of standing firm and said, no, this is truth. And we're going to have this one out. They backed down. We have to understand that in the face of these right-wing fascists and others, they don't have any conceptualization of compromise. Their objective is to take us out. And when we back down, supposedly trying to be the adults in the room, it leads them to believe that we're weak. We've got to be speaking truth to what's going on. What the congressman is saying is absolutely right. We cannot back away from that. Every time that Barr or Trump tries to blame Antifa or the left for being, we have to say, no, that is not documented. But let's tell you what is documented. These fascists that you support running around with guns, they are the threat. They're the ones that need to be smashed. They need to be arrested. They need to be infiltrated. Don't talk to us about what the left is doing and what Black Lives Matter is doing.
Reverend Smart, you're muted, sir. It's okay. It's okay.
You know, Brother Fletcher, you're so right, because remember when everyone's talking, and I've said it, that Donald Trump has emboldened white supremacy in that whole movement. But remember, they became stronger under Obama just because he was a black man. They were mad that a black man took over this country, supposedly took over this country. So they began to, remember, they would bring guns to the rallies he was at. That's right. You know, they have the audacity because they wanted to put the black man in his place. Trump has now come. Trump has really emboldened, has ignited the movement, and that's why we have today. They're trying to take over, kidnap a governor of a state. These folks, these fools are crazy. But here's a danger: as a pastor and as a nonviolent person, you're revving up this total disregard for black life, this total disregard for our brown life has caused the rise of a new movement. We're seeing now tons of African Americans marching with guns through the streets. That's dangerous, because whenever we have went to arms, we always get blown away. They have bigger machine guns, bigger military bombs to blow us up like they did in Philadelphia that time. So I have said that we have to be very careful in what we say. That's why we have to fight the white supremacists and make sure that doesn't get out of hands, so that our younger sisters and brothers don't say, okay, we're going to take matters in our own hands.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask Senator, Amendment 3 is currently on the ballot in Missouri for this upcoming election?
Yes, that's correct. It'll be on the ballot for the on November 3rd for the general election. And just to kind of reiterate what the rest of the panelists has been saying, we have to be clear. White supremacy is mobilized right now. And we need to do the same, not in a violent or confrontational way, but through our vote.
Yes, sir.
And that's how permanent interests are being at the forefront of what we need in terms of representation and what we need in terms of good public policy. But I can tell you right now, what I see happening at the national level, and we have to be clear, what Congressman Carson and the rest of members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the Democratic Caucus, what they're dealing with, they see firsthand what what this country is defined by, and what the true feelings and intentions of the president, as well as colleagues that support this president. And I'm confident that we all understand firsthand that if we don't get out and vote, and we don't get out and make sure that our voice is being heard, we're going to continue to go down a pathway of another 4 years of not only just dog whistles, but blatantly disrespect and lack of a conscience in terms of moving our country in a direction that's become inclusive and actually provides a safe space for people of color and those of disenfranchised communities.
Another important aspect to this, right? We saw recently that the deadline for the census was extended. Right. This is another question to anybody who'd like to pick it up. What is the importance of the census to ensure that Black voters and voters of other backgrounds are counted?
Well, is that a question for me?
If you'd like to take it.
Okay. Well, one, so from what I understand, we just the census just ended last Sunday in terms of being able to count folks for the census. I can tell you right now, those numbers are still concerning when you think about Black, underserved, and disenfranchised communities. And it's going to have a severe consequence depending on what these numbers look like when it comes to representation. As Congressman Carson knows, as well as the rest of the panelists, what services and what funding are coming to our communities and our states. And that's something that's a serious concern for me as a state senator, is really concerned about what our representation looks like. The legislature draws to congressional lines here in Missouri, and the census will serve as the keystone to that on what one of two congressional districts in Missouri that we have. And the only other one we have is in Kansas City right now with Congressman Cleaver. So it's going to be a very challenging thing. And it's going to be a duty of mine as well as the rest of our Democratic caucus to ensure that we have a district that could not only maintain representation, but also representation that serves in the interest of the larger population.
Brother Wasim, you know, I have another, I hate to leave this, but I'm going to about white supremacy facing Blacks and Jewish brothers. So God bless you so much, and thank you,
sir.
I really enjoyed this, my.
Thank you, Rev. I appreciate you.
Good
Thank you for joining us,
you.
sir. Have a good night, sir. Good luck.
Okay, thank you.
And so then I'm going to just pose our last question to Congressman Carson, a question actually from the audience. You kind of referenced it a little bit earlier, Congressman, but what would have happened if those Michigan militia members, right, which is also indicative, if they had Muslim names and faces? What would that look like today? What would the news cycle look like?
Oh, as you know, you probably would have had some kind of memo go out through federal agencies and local police agencies to ramp up their efforts. More mosques would be surveilled as they are. I think you'd have more recruitment efforts at getting informants inside of mosques. I think Muslims will start feeling more and more uncomfortable. I mean, it's an experience that happened post 9/11 where Muslims were targeted, Sikhs were targeted, anyone who had a foreign sounding name was targeted. But I think even in this, it has allowed the Muslim community to really look within itself to correct some of its issues. I can remember being a young man, having a great uncle who was an imam would allow me to come to the masjid to register people to vote. And I would hear, oh, brother Astaghfirullah, brother no, brother brother Salim, yeah, that's we don't do that. And I can even remember before September 11th, a lot of immigrant brothers and sisters, the same people who complain about why isn't anyone speaking up for our issues, they wouldn't even return the greetings of Salam Alaikum to African American Muslims. And then 9/11 hit. And so those same Muslims who were legally white, checking off a box, became socially non-white. And now they had to experience everything that Black folks who had paved the way were telling them about as it relates to American society. And so this awakening took place within the community, and it's still happening, quite frankly, where now you have Muslim brothers and sisters, Arab brothers and sisters, South Asian brothers and sisters, and so forth, working in solidarity with African American brothers and sisters. And so you raised the point, had these names been Arabic sounding names or Muslim sounding names, if you will, I think you'd have anxiety in our community. You'd have folks who obviously would have had to denounce these terrible acts, myself included. And you'd have a growing discussion about where we stand in our community. You would have some leaders who would probably try to overcorrect, and you would have some elements in our communities whose anxiety would increase, and some people's whose resentment and disillusionment toward the government would be more exacerbated. And so now I think is the time for us to really start looking forward as you've seen law enforcement agencies, the FBI and local police departments try to build relationships with our communities. But I think, God forbid, an act like this happens in the future where you have so-called Muslims involved, where if our community is going to build relationships with the law enforcement community, we saw what happened during J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO. That's a perfect example of how gateways can be produced to profile our communities without having met the reasonable suspicion or probable cause test. But if we're to have a relationship with law enforcement, because we don't want bad actors in our community misrepresenting us, the relationship can't just be transactional. It has to be one of respect, it has to be one of equity, and it has to be one where mutual interest is demonstrated.
Yeah.
If I can just jump in real quick.
Yes,
if
sir.
these individuals had been Muslim or Black, they'd be dead. Let's be very, very clear. They would be dead. They would not have been incarcerated. They would be dead. They would have been shot and killed attempting to escape. Let's just be very, very clear about that. Now, this was not a kidnapping. This is what's called a putsch, P-U-T-S-H, an attempted coup. That's what we witnessed. We should not describe what happened in Michigan as a kidnapping attempt. That is far too light. These individuals were planning a coup against the government of Michigan. And if they had been Black or Muslim, they'd be dead. We know that. We all know that.
And you know, this honest conversation, honestly, I feel like I'm learning so much, and I'm gonna backtrack. I'm gonna correct myself on a few things. Mr. Fletcher, you just said that I gave them the benefit of the doubt. We're giving them the benefit of the doubt by calling it a kidnapping, right? That's the immediate, giving the benefit of that comes with being white as opposed to being Black or Muslim. And I want to apologize for not including whether in my question the hypothetical if they were of Black identity, because that should also be included. And Congressman Carson, I promise you that I in that AMP will continue to pick up the onus to address anti-Blackness in the immigrant, Arab, South Asian, Muslim communities, and ensure that we're tackling these issues, that we're talking about Black Lives Matter, that we're talking about all these issues that affect our brothers and sisters, whether of the same faith or not. I want to remind everybody that this video is going to be archived, so we are going to have a copy. If you want to reach out, you can reach out to AMP. And I want to thank our speakers so much for tonight's talk. And I promise you, if it was up to me, we'd still go on. But unfortunately, we only have until 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We appreciate it, and we look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you.
very much.
Nice meeting, Brother Fletcher and Senator Williams.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
You all take care.
Oh, Congressman, Brother Fletcher, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to connecting with all of you once.
Absolutely.
Better in the
No doubt.
All right. Same here. Take care.
Take
Thank
care.
you.